Welcome back, everyone.
Hello.
It is Brian and ShaRhonda Dawson from Brondihouse, and we are here again to just talk about the importance of Black history and another lesson for this week. And this week, we're going to really dive into a little bit more of what people usually don't talk about when it comes to Black history, and that is the early West African civilizations.
Right. So on the timeline, in Africa, the Nile River Valley on the east was African, ran for 3, 4, 5,000 years. And then around 300 AD or so, really about 300 BC, there started to be a lot of invasions of Arabs, I think, then the Greek and Roman that came in, and Assyrians. And so there was also a mass exodus of Black people out of Africa, out of the Nile River Valley, specifically like Sudan area. And they went west to West Africa. And we started to see some of the same values and structures that were created and maintained in the Nile River Valley start to come up in West Africa. And the first and earliest civilization in Africa at that time is the Ghana Empire. And just as a side note, Ghana Empire is not connected to the country Ghana now. The country Ghana now, they renamed themselves Ghana after this empire because it was so successful and grand. And so it was the Ghana Empire, and that started in 300
AD. Yeah, around 300 AD. And it was, as ShaRhonda said, it was through this mass migration of people coming westward from the Nile River Valley, and they brought things with them. They brought, their ironwork, and that really set them apart from people at the time in that area. And we're talking the western coast of Africa. And what made these people really become the large empire that they did is because they had two things that were in dire need. One was gold. There were extremely large gold deposits in the area that became known as the Ghana Empire. And we're talking about between the Senegal and Niger rivers. And the other thing was salt. You have to remember that during that time, there was no refrigeration. When we're talking 300, 400, 500 AD, there was no refrigeration. And so if you wanted to preserve your food, you needed salt. It wasn't just for spicing your food up. It was for when you wanted to preserve your food to last throughout the season. And they positioned themselves where not only were they near these great water sources of the Niger and Senegal River, but they were between the interior part of Africa, and they were between the Sahara Desert. So anyone who was traveling and they were trying to get from interior Africa into Northern Africa and then to Europe had to come between this ancient empire of Ghana. And they said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to levy taxes on everyone on their way in and on their way out. And they became a huge empire because of it, not only because of their gold and salt deposits, but this was one of the first periods where you see an empire coming to be because of their ability to tax commerce. And so you had the ancient empire of Ghana that became, I guess what you would look at them as one of the first examples of banking. You would have individuals who come in and they would say, well, I have this much money and I'll pay these taxes. And when they would go up, they would say, well, I don't want to keep all my money on me. So if you could write me a note and say, I have this much money, and we can definitely, we get into more of this in our classes, but it was a way of people not only transferring their goods and services, but ideas in and out of Africa. They had a matrilineal line of succession, which means that the rulership went through the women. So
Mhm.
if a man, let's say, was the ruler, his son wouldn't inherit the throne. It would go to his sister's child. And
Mhm.
that's how they kind of kept it in a line of women.
Mhm.
One of the things that ended up becoming very fruitful from this is obviously there were a lot of a
Mhm.
greater respect for women in this culture. And so
Mhm.
sometimes people think that ancient civilizations didn't respect women because they're watching Game of Thrones or whatever. But this was a completely different situation. This was a society
Mhm.
where women had great respect and honor. And after the Ghana civilization began to dwindle, because different invaders were coming in and taking over their gold,
Mhm.
uh, there came a rise of the Mali Empire.
And the Mali Empire is the one that I'm obsessed with. It's people who know me personally. I have been doing so much research and writing books, and I love talking about it. Okay, so there's this epic story of the founding of the Kingdom of Mali that involves Sundiata Keita. And a lot of people say that The Lion King, the Disney movie, was based off of the Sundiata story. And so the story goes that there was a king, a very handsome king who was married, and he was in control of this kingdom, um, Niamey, that was still left over from Ghana Empire. Um, and he was told by someone, by a fortune teller, that one day there would be a ugly woman that would come into his town, and he was to marry this ugly woman, um, and they would have a child, and that child would be the founder of of their savior of their country. And so this woman, Sogolon Kande, it was called the Buffalo Woman. And so they said, when you have a buffalo and a lion that can create, you'll have the greatest power and potential in a person. So you have Buffalo Woman, the Lion King. And so they're born. So Sandiata came because of this union. However, when he was born, he was disabled. He wasn't talking, he wasn't able to walk um, till he was almost 7. And and at that time, the king, Megan's wife, the first wife, was like, "Oh, this was just a silly prophecy that somebody had told." And he look at him, he can't walk, he can't talk. This kid is nothing. Um, and by the age of 7, Sandiata was able to pull himself up, start walking, and start talking, and became this amazing hunter and warrior. And I bring that up because I think the important part of that story is that we don't know what our destiny is. And sometimes we can be born into situations, and born with parents that other people may despise, or with physical difficulties, and we can still be great, and that those things make us great. And so that's a lot of the mission behind the Sandiata story, right? Is that he overcame these difficulties. They were kicked out of the land. He was able to come back, unite all of these separate kingdoms in West Africa that worked together at the time, to then unite as one country and to defeat their enemy. Um, and from that came the country of Mali, the Empire of Mali. And there's even some scholarship being done now that this was the first country to come up with human rights, right? So they had abolished slavery. There was a right for anyone to get food and to grow land, and everyone to have a job. And so I'll put a link in there called the Mandan Charter. um and in the story, it's told a lot, and there's many different ways of telling it. But again, I think it's important that we tell this to our young people, because this is all before the Europeans came to America. And in the transatlantic slave trade, most of us come from West Africa. There are lots of other stories in Central Africa and South Africa, but for most of us, this is our history, um, pre-America. So Sundiata Keita is known as the founder of the Mali Empire, and the Lion King, or the Buffalo Woman's son, I like to call him the Buffalo Woman's son, is known as this hero. And at that time, the way that history was told was verbally. And so there was different classes of people, and there's something called a griot. And it's a French word, and you spell it
Griot.
T. That's how you spell it, griot. And so people sometimes simplify it and call it just a storyteller. But in actuality, what a griot was somebody that was a historian, a political advisor, a strategic thinker. It's like, I'm thinking of the Game of Thrones, when Ned was like the hand of the king, like this person, like that's kind of what a griot was. They had to go to school. There's levels, there's all these tests to be passed. And so the story of Sundiata, the founding of the country, and then further stories that are of importance are told by griots. And griots do this with storytelling, but they also do it with music. They also do it with audience participation. And again, this is different than European history, because a lot of the times, like we had the documents from Aristotle or Plato, or I'm blanking on his name, the historian.
Herodotus.
Thank
the
you.
Greek
Yes.
historian.
Right. And they'll say, well, this is the proof, right?
Right.
Because he said this one thing. But yet in Africa, you have generations of people that are griots that have been taught by their fathers and their fathers and fathers and fathers these same stories, and they had to take tests. And so there was an academic component to being a historian then. It wasn't just you could get up and say, I'm a griot, right? No, you had to actually go through, you have to now go through a process in order to be certified to tell the story of your people, because they believe in the power of word and sharing our stories.
Yeah, and I think that that kind of leads us into our next person of note. Um, Even though Black history is sometimes discounted because it's a verbal oral tradition where people are passing down stories, and other traditions, they value more the written word. And that's why many of our stories aren't often told, because they're like, well, there aren't any books. In Mali, there was the rise of the world's greatest university at the time, which is Timbuktu. You may have heard of Timbuktu and didn't understand exactly, what Timbuktu was. It was the greatest university in its kind, and everyone was coming to Timbuktu to learn in Mali. To give you an example, during the Dark Ages in Europe, unfortunately, this was around 1000 AD up until around 1400 AD. There wasn't a lot of learning, and there were unfortunately a lot of warfare, and disruption. Many of the writings of Greece and Rome were all transferred down to the Mali Empire at the University of Timbuktu. And it was only because of that during the Renaissance, individuals were able to go back and get that knowledge that had been lost from Socrates, from Plato, from Aristotle, from Herodotus, from all these individuals. And it's because the University at Timbuktu had been this place of knowledge during the Dark Ages, where everyone was going to learn in West Africa. It's not something that people talk about, but they were only able to have a Renaissance because those documents had been preserved in this African university. And it gave rise to another leader in the Mali Empire. And of course, at this time, they're also, they still had their salt, they still had their gold deposits, and it gave rise to the richest person in the history of the world.
Ever.
Not in the history of Africa, not the richest African person or the richest Black person in this century. The richest person in the history of the world is Mansa Musa. His estimated wealth, it was at $400 billion. That's more than Bill Gates. That's more than Jeff Bezos. That's more than Mark Zuckerberg,
Beyonce.
$400 billion. And it was not only because of the gold deposits that were in Mali, but because of those trade routes. And it's said that they sold almost as many books as they did in the transfer and trade of gold, because books were so precious at the time, and there was such a large gathering of knowledge in Mali. Mansa Musa is known as taking the Hajj, the pilgrimage, from Mali to Mecca, and he had thousands of people in his caravan, and he had so much gold, so much money. They say that when he went through Egypt, he was giving away so much money that he actually disrupted the Egyptian economy by giving away so much gold that it actually devalued the currency, because he was so generous in giving away his money. And what was so magnificent about him is not only was he coming and giving away money, but there was this transfer of knowledge, that he was coming from, the most intelligent, I guess people would call it the real life Wakanda. If there ever was a place where there was an African nation that was more developed than everywhere else in the world and had more money than any other place in the world, it was Mali, the Mali Empire. So he came through, he gave so much money in Egypt, he devalued their currency, where people had so much gold that it led to inflation. That's how much money he was giving away. And so he goes to the Hajj, he takes the pilgrimage to Mecca and comes back. And on the way back, he was able to actually bring a lot of the architects with him, a lot of the builders that had been in Egypt. And you see this transfer of knowledge and information between West and North and East Africans. And so you see that all throughout this path that he took, you can see this evolution of architecture across Africa, and it's still there today. That this richest person in the world, Mansa Musa, that people, have really never even heard of, and he's the wealthiest person in the history of the planet.
And so for Black kids, it's so important that we know and that we tell them that we come from a culture that has always valued knowledge and valued intellect and valued being smart. We come from a culture of wealth, right? Of trade, of industry. We come from a culture that valued women in a way that is unfathomable to a lot of people now. Like even watching Bridgerton, which I think everyone is right. It's like the whole goal in life for white women was to get married to a man, otherwise they were going to be destitute, right? And that wasn't what the situation was like in West Africa. Women had a different role, and so a lot of the problems that we have and the stereotypes that we hear about Black kids and Black people not valuing books, not valuing um, learning, not valuing women, not uh, being resourceful, not being able to start businesses. All of that's not grounded in fact, right? Like we were doing this. We had the Mali Empire. Some of the ethnic groups that are there. One is Mindi, which I did my African DNA test and that came back, but that was part of this culture, and it also was um, the Amistad story. He was Mindy. A lot of the crap, what am I thinking? Alex Haley, the story of roots goes back to this Mali Empire. And so because this empire was so rich, was so powerful, and eventually started doing a lot of international trade, people came in, right? That's what happened. People come in and they start sowing divisions because they want to take what is there. And so in some ways, when we look at the tragedy and what happened to us in slavery, it is hard because they took our stories, right, and they replaced it, and they told us that we were slaves, that we were savages, that we were in bushes, and that when Europe came, they were civilized and they helped us. And so not only did they take us from our families, they took us from our rich cultural history. And so we want to make sure that during Black History Month, we can we can challenge some of those myths, and not just for Black kids, but for white people too, to know that you didn't save us, right? Like, actually Africa was okay. And it's important that you teach that prior to colonization and prior to Portuguese arriving in 1400s, there were civilizations, there was universities, there was iron, there was
you had thriving African civilizations. And so if we as Black people, or if people who are looking at Black history only go back as far as the enslavement of African people, you really miss not only, the grandeur, you're missing the story. You know what I mean? Yes, it is true that that is a moment in our history, but in a way you could say that that was kind of like the end part of that part of the story. This African greatness, where you had universities and doctors and architects, and you had legal systems. When you overlook that and you only see the enslavement of African people, you miss the fact that there's a teachable moment there, where if Black people and children in particular have to believe that they're doing something for the first time, that they're being educated for the first time, that they're creating hospitals for the first time, that they're creating accountants and architects for the first time, and they say, oh, I'm the first person in my family to go to college, and they honestly think that they're the first person in their family to go to college. No, you might be the first person recently, but you might have had university graduates in your family 300 years ago, 400 years ago. And so when you see it in its complexity and the true length and duration of its history, it gives you a different perspective of Black history and Black culture and Black possibility.
And so to all of the Black kids that may be listening right now, I want to stress that you have a legacy within your DNA that is royal and grand and great. And we just have to reconnect. And like Sundiata, who was born in the circumstance with a mother who they discarded, who had a disability, who couldn't talk, he was able and he was divined by God to go and reunite all of the kingdoms that had fallen apart to build this great empire, right? So where's our Sundiata? That's a more important lesson to me than the Lion King, right? The Disney version. It's in us is greatness, right? And in us, when we unite and when we put our strengths together and our resources together, and we have a common goal around the Creator and God's vision for us, the possibilities are endless. So happy Black History Month.
All right. Till next time.
That was great. And we